March 14th. This was a very stressful day for me, since I had to deliver my closing argument. I wanted to get going right at 9 a.m. because the defense had announced that they intended to split their closing between the two lawyers, that is, between Jerry Buting and Dean Strang. And I wanted the case to get to the jury the same day that we started the arguments. But we started the day squabbling over the possibility that some female juror may have made an inappropriate comment while out to dinner 2 weeks ago, and we had to question her. The juror admitted that she was at the restaurant for the fish fry and had, quote, a few old fashions, but denied making any statements about the case. The problem, of course, is that the rest of the citizen's story checked out. So we believed she probably was shooting her mouth off how Avery was guilty, at least with the assistance of alcohol. We decided to each use a peremptory strike. The defense struck the juror who previously sat on the Remaker civil jury, and the state then struck the woman who spoke at the restaurant. We agreed to make a woman earlier from the case the lone alternate. This process took us past 10 a.m., so we had to hurry to get everything done today. The jury instructions took about 40 minutes. I began my closing argument. My argument started about 10:30 a.m., I guess, and although I was very nervous, I methodically went through the facts, fact by fact, that the jury should consider. Arguing facts also allowed me to note the striking difference between the state's theory, based on science, on eyewitness accounts, on physical evidence, and the defense theory of the case, which, up until the closing, had included speculation about the police planting evidence or guesswork of how blood or other physical evidence ended up where. I argued that facts are stubborn. You can try to twist them, but they don't change. My theme of hit them over the head with the facts required I stay away from defense theories as much as I could. I wasn't going to help them make their argument for them. I really tried to limit myself to the facts that were either not challenged by the evidence or that I was sure the jury had adopted as true. My facts, which were my topics, including processing the SUV, the gun that was used, the timelines of the principals involved using phone records mostly, DNA analysis, and concluded with the manner and the cause of death.
What's he trying to sell me? And why is he trying to sell me that? Does he have an interest in the outcome of what he's saying? Does he have some kind of a bias? Or does he have some kind of a prejudice? And of course he does. And you weigh those kind of factors, not just how they say it, but whether or not they have those influences. And well, you do the same thing as, it's a little more formalized, but you do the same thing as a juror. It's not just what they say, it's how they say it, and were they in a position to know the things that they're talking to you about. And my suggestion to you, my argument to you as the lead prosecutor, when the guy who's in charge of the case points to you and looks at you without apology and emphatically says, nobody entered that vehicle and nobody tampered with that vehicle, that's something that you should give great credibility and great weight to. All right? We finish what's called the chain of custody, or the transfer from Manitowoc to Calumet County with Sergeant Tyson. You heard from Sergeant Bill Tyson, who completes, if you will, the chain, that is, who watched the vehicle and who took over, and about 3 o'clock. And at least from 3 o'clock on, we learn then that Calumet County takes over. Calumet County takes over then with not just perimeter security, but takes over security of the SUV of that particular part of the scene. It's the transfer of management control about this case that's why Calumet County and DCI got involved. Let me just spend just a couple of minutes about that. Manitowoc County Sheriff's deputies were never precluded from being involved in this case. The resources of Manitowoc County law enforcement officers was crucial. Mr. Fossbender never apologized for that. And think about why. Because we're in Manitowoc County. It's the Manitowoc County Sheriff's deputies that are going to know if we need a wrecker, where are we going to go? If we need some tarps, where are we going to know? If we need some ropes, where are we going to go? If we need some bodies to do some searching, if we need some trained evidence techs, it's a logical place to find them. And that's why Manitowoc County remained involved in this case. You heard the testimony from Mr. Fossbender that it was the management decisions, that it was the control decisions over this particular investigation that was removed from Manitowoc County. Never, ever, ever the resources. Never that we couldn't or shouldn't use Manitowoc County law enforcement officers. All right? I hope you all understand that. I hope you understand the difference then between decision making, how a case should be directed, and whether or not a Manitowoc County law enforcement officer should have been used in this case. All right? Fact number 3. The vehicle's locked. We learned at this time the weather is worsening. It's getting dark. The crime lab is called in. And so our third uncontested fact, my third fact that I want you to consider when deciding this entire case, is something called a recovery process, the SUV recovery. And for the first time, I guess, we learn, and it's the first example of the diversity of agencies that are involved in this investigative effort, this largest criminal investigation that we've talked about, of the resources that need to be allocated. We have civilian searchers like canine handlers. We have law enforcement officers like from DCI and Calumet County. We have scientists that are brought in like people from the crime lab. We have, as you heard, other civilians brought in to help, like the wrecker operator and the tow truck driver and the driver of the trailer in this recovery effort. But this is a good place to really kind of get your mind around the expanse of this investigation. And remember, we're an hour into it. We're only an hour into the investigation, and already the resources are being called in because the enormity of this investigative effort is so apparent to everybody. I told you on my opening statement about what I called a four-legged hero that may have overstated Brutus a little bit, but Brutus is certainly a qualified asset that you should be considering in this case. Brutus hit on the SUV. All right? And if the officers didn't have enough suspicion before that particular moment, all right, that should have been and was, in fact, a very important part of this case, because Brutus hitting on the SUV told the handler, told Julie Kramer, who you heard from, one very important thing, that either a dead body was still in that particular SUV or a dead body had been in that SUV. Right? This is another changing moment. It's another time in this investigation where, very importantly, the investigation changes and becomes much more of a criminal investigation than a missing person investigation. We heard about Brutus's search that he did, a real methodical kind of search. As I was thinking about it, even though Brutus is a dog, Brutus approached that search much like our law enforcement officers, very methodically, very professionally, and came up with the same kinds of results that our other officers have in this case as well. One of the two lead investigators, Tom Fossbender, from the Division of Criminal Investigation, talked to you about the agencies that were involved. I'll talk to you about that a little bit later. But mentioned something called resource allocation, putting the teams together for searching all the different properties. That first night, Mr. Fossbender clearly was in charge of deciding who's going to go into what house and why those people were going to do that, and talked about the search plan, talked about why Steven Avery was a person of interest, gave you that obvious answer that everybody's giving is because Steven Avery was the last person to see Teresa alive. But Mr. Fossbender knew that first afternoon what an overwhelming task this was. He knew what an overwhelming job the coordination of this largest investigative effort was going to include, and again, without apology, Mr. Fossbender told you at that early stage, all the early clues pointed to one man. They pointed to one person, even early on. Who's the last person to see her alive? Where was the vehicle that was found? Was there an attempt by Mr. Avery to lure or to invite, if you want to use a more polite term, this woman onto the property? It all pointed to one person, and although Investigator Fossbender said that he had other irons in the fire, he was looking at other individuals, he was looking at other family members, he was looking at possibly old boyfriends or people that might have had contact with Teresa, or who else she might have seen that day, Mr. Zipper or Mrs. Zipper or Mr. Schmitz, or where she might have been going. And all those things are important. And a law enforcement officer does all of those things. But law enforcement officers aren't stupid either. Law enforcement officers understand that when you have limited resources, when there's just so many officers to go around, you better direct your resources to where this thing is likely going. And that night, the likely place that this was going was towards Steven Avery. And so a team was put together to search Steven Avery's trailer that very first night on the 5th, subject to a search warrant. I'm getting ahead of myself just a little bit, and I apologize because we're still talking about the recovery of the SUV. The scientist, Mr. Ertl, who himself is a DNA analyst, that's what he does during the day, but on weekends, like many other crime lab employees, Mr. Ertl volunteers to go on field responses. He volunteers to go to crime scenes and look at evidence and things just like this. And Mr. Ertl gave his opinion, gave his expertise in opinions to Mr. Fossbender, made the decision that because the weather was becoming progressively worse, I think Mr. Ertl used the term dramatic weather had occurred on the evening of the 5th after he had got there. Mr. Ertl verified, if you remember, and importantly, verified that the vehicle was locked, that all the doors were locked to the vehicle, and decided that although they were going to process the outside of the vehicle, that the real processing of this car was going to take place in Madison. That the SUV was going to be transported as it was to a more pristine type of a location, to a place where the climate could be controlled and where they could control the processing of the vehicle. Mr. Ertl also told you that this vehicle was obviously obscured or attempted to be obscured. You couldn't see it from, as an example, an airplane. Mr. Drum told you that they couldn't see a car like that from an airplane when they did their air search a day or two before. Mr. Ertl also told you, and if you remember, we'll go to a picture of Mr. Ertl, who standing right here. with Mr. Fassbender and one other crime lab person. Mr. Earl told you that right on the other side, you see this? Right on the other side of the SUV, running all the way along this ridge, was this berm. Mr. Earl talked about this being 15 to 20 feet high. Remember, he talked about walking over that particular berm where he, after he got to the top of it, kind of slid down, or gravity kind of assisted his going down the other side of that berm. That is important, or it may be for you important, when deciding whether or not somebody knew to put this car here. It certainly couldn't be driven in from the south. That's the point, all right? The point is that it couldn't be driven into that property unless somebody knew that property, unless whoever put that car there knew how to get the car into this location. Again, it's near the car crusher. It's near a place where other cars are to be crushed. It's near cars that have been crushed, the 54 cars that we talked about. But Mr. Ertl's job, primary job at this location, is to process the outside of the vehicle, but then to get a wrecker, to get a tow assembly set up, and to put this on an enclosed trailer and take it to Madison for processing. And so we move to our next uncontested fact, fact number 4. We move our investigation to Madison.
Mr. Kratz?
Well, however unwise it may be, this is argument, Judge, and if the jury decides that they are in fact contested, they can make that conclusion as well.
All right. Members of the jury, I think I'll simply remind you about one of the instructions that you read, and that is that the closing arguments are just that, arguments. They are not facts. You should take anything that's said by either party as argument. The fact, for example, that one side said something is uncontested may not necessarily make it so. It depends on your interpretation of the evidence, and the other side will also have a chance to respond in its argument. Mr. Kratz, you may proceed.
Thank you, Judge, and the judge is absolutely right, and Mr. Strang is absolutely right. And if you remember one of the defense attorneys putting on some evidence that this car wasn't taken to Madison for processing, then you should adopt that. You should adopt your memory. I'm calling it uncontested as an argument. I'm saying because we haven't heard any evidence to the contrary. We haven't heard any answers from a witness to the contrary. That's why I'm characterizing this as uncontested. The evidence in this case was that this particular SUV was taken to Madison. It was taken to a garage in Madison. It was taken to the crime lab where this vehicle could be processed. And we heard from Mr. Grophy and Ms. Culhane and Mr. Riddle, and in fact we'll talk about a fourth individual from Mr. Stalkey about the processing or the looking at this vehicle in a more controlled environment. Mr. Grophy testified that after the vehicle was initially looked at, that when the vehicle was open, that Mr. Grophy started photographing, but importantly photographing from the outside of the vehicle, not from the inside. And that's why his testimony included that he photographed both on the 6th, that's Sunday, and also on the 7th. Because on the 6th, Mr. Grophy testified that he photographed from the outside of the vehicle, that he could photograph things where he didn't have to crawl into the vehicle because he couldn't get the inside shots yet. He didn't want to contaminate the inside of the vehicle and waited for the vehicle to be what's called processed by the lead individual who was in charge of processing the car, and that was Sherry Culhane. Now, Ms. Culhane has lots and lots of involvement in this particular case. Ms. Culhane, you heard, was the unit leader or the unit head of the DNA section of the Madison crime lab, and she was chosen, or she assigned herself the responsibility of this case. And it was the unit head, the head of the DNA section, who herself processed this particular vehicle. Ms. Culhane, as you heard testimony, took some swabs, took some samples of the interior of the vehicle. It's more than just the 4 pictures that I'm putting up for you, but the swabs of around the ignition area, the swabs of the seats, the cuttings. She cut out portions of the seat, I believe the testimony was. Swabs of the CD case, swabs of the back door, and also on the interior of the what's called the cargo area of the SUV. The defense will have an opportunity to present a argument in this case. We heard some questions of some law enforcement officers about planting evidence. We didn't hear anything about how an officer might plant a stain like this, what's called by Mr. Stalkey a contact stain, which covers evidence quite important indeed. We heard from Mr. Riddle, who is primarily a fingerprint guy, and although he didn't obtain any identifiable prints, at least those that were suitable for comparison, Mr. Riddle also had the responsibility of inventory.
My trial strategy to keep reminding the jury of Teresa's humanity was also a theme I tried to return to throughout my closing. They had to understand this was a real person, with very real loss felt by her very real family. The most drama came from my description of what the DNA evidence was telling the jury. In my opening, I had alluded to the fact that Teresa was leaving clues for the jury to consider, like her DNA or her voice message. That was the moment to bring the point home. Teresa's DNA, her blood, her bones, her tissue, was her way of telling the jury, this is where I was. This is how I was killed. This is who killed me. Teresa was telling you, the jury, all of this information. I told them it was their job to hear it. As feared, given the late start of the closings, my argument went past the lunch hour and concluded around 1:45 p.m. It took 2.5 total hours.